Hey friends, I'm going to talk fast because there's a lot to unpack here. I posted a video yesterday about why I hate Spotify, etc., and I got a lot of great comments. I really appreciate it. Most of them were consistent with my views, but there were a few that weren't. Cool. One of which is from this gentleman right here, Mr. Drew Rippey, also known as Southwind, and his comments went a lot further than this. There were several of them, and I respect what he has to say. But I've been doing this for over 30 years, so I want to address some of the things he talked about, which were the hierarchy in the old days, and it's a lot easier to make music today, and there are people who would never be having a career otherwise. Totally agree with that, and that's fine. The hierarchy thing, I never had an issue with the hierarchy. I never had to deal with it. In the past, all the people I dealt with who were in positions of power when I was coming up in the music business were smart, had a lot of instinct, and they knew how to nurture and pick talent. That was my experience. I was also very lucky. I never probably should have gotten signed because I wasn't out in the clubs really playing. I didn't even have a band yet. I wrote great songs and I could sing, and it was the great singer-songwriter scare of the 90s, I guess. I don't know. But once I was given that chance, I worked my bloody ass off. One of the things that's great about the old way of doing things is you had to normally, not me, but you had to work your way up through the clubs, building an audience, knowing how to command a crowd, and expanding that beyond just a local market, and thus you were a big commodity for a record label, and of course they'd be interested in you. And you had to work really hard during this process to make your songs better, to compete with people like the Paul Simons, the Neil Youngs, the Joni Mitchells of the world, and if they weren't good enough, they let you know, and they told you why they weren't good enough, and you worked harder and you got to a certain level and you got signed. And if you didn't, you didn't. Now, were there people who didn't get lucky and didn't get picked like I did? Of course there were. But I don't think you can blame that on the hierarchy. That's just the way of the world. Life is rough and you have to work your ass off. And sometimes working your ass off doesn't matter anyway, right? Right. So there were problems in the old days. There were certainly abuses and crazy contracts and people who shouldn't have been in the business who were gangsters. Yeah, there's a lot of that. But as far as the hierarchy that I dealt with, that wasn't really an issue. There were many, many other issues, but not that. Now, my biggest problem today is just because music is cheap and easy to make doesn't mean you should be making it. I think there's a lot of product that's being thrown out there. When I first started, there were 2,500 albums a week. 10 years in, there were 25,000 albums a week. Now there's 250,000 albums a week. That's far too much for the public to digest for you to break through. So yes, you can have a career much cheaper and easier than in the past, but will it have the longevity? I don't know. We're going to have to wait and see on that. But just because it's easier and cheaper doesn't make it better. And last but not least, my big issue with Spotify, besides all the obvious things, is pay us fairly. You're making millions. You got rich. You went public off of our blood. Pay us a fair wage. Let's negotiate. Let's negotiate what our wage should be fairly and what your percentage should be fairly. And then I will have much less of an issue with streaming. And yeah, let the best man or woman win after that. Do you know what I mean?